Welcome to Fix It with Fowler. My name's Steve and I'm going to show you how to lift some tongue and groove floorboards. Okay, so as you can see, this board has already been taken up quite badly by the look of it. However, what I'm going to first do is I'm going to take this board up. It's only been screwed down, so really simple 5-minute job. And that is as easy as it is to take up a board that's screwed down. Obviously, we're not really trying to do that, but it allows you to look into the floor and do a few things really. So over the other side of the room, we could have a look under the floor and check if there's anything under there like pipes or cables. Now cables should run half the depth of the joist. The pipes, however, normally will be, unless the plastic pipes, will be chopped into the top of the joist. You can normally tell if that's the case because there's no fixings where the pipe is. So have a look. If there's fixings in the board, normally means you're okay. And normally the pipe will run across them joists. So the reason I've took this up is so that we can get an idea of the depth of these boards. So the first thing to do, in this instance I've got a square, but a ruler is all you need really, or a tape measure. So you can put your square on the edge, and that looks like the board's 16mm. I think the bog standard is about 18mm. So if we couldn't have got this board up, we can always look for any other gaps. We could do exactly the same thing, leave it loose, push it through the gap, press it down, tighten it up. When we lift it up, we still get the same measurement. Now, why do we need to do that? Well, there's a few reasons really, and I suppose the first thing to consider is how you're going to lift the next boards. So this is the piece of floorboard, and the reason I've got it here is to show you actually that this is the tongue and groove board. This side is the groove, you can see the rebate there. Now this was the tongue. I'm not quite sure what that's been took off with, but it doesn't look like anything good. So what we're actually trying to do is make a clean cut in between the boards to cut the tongue off the board. So we've got a couple of tools we could use from that. Now previously people used to use a hammer and chisel and used to actually split that off, and that looks pretty much like what's happened here. I mean, pretty terrible really, and that's the result you get. We don't want that. We want a nice clean cut, so we need a cutting tool. So we've got two options really. We could use something like a multi-tool. So this multi-tool comes with all sorts of attachments, so you can actually use it for all different jobs really. Different cutting blades that can cut metal as well as wood. You get things that take the grout out between tiles. Good universal bit of kit. So in this instance, what's so good about these is the actual width of the blade, which allows you to get into real tight spaces, in this instance into the gap between the tongue and groove board without actually damaging the boards. The only drawback for this in this instance will be that there's no way of setting a depth on this blade. So if we were to cut through this board, as you can see, it's just a little bit deeper than the board itself. So the problem with that is that if we don't know what's under the floor, that could be electric cables or plumbing, which is obviously pipes, then we could damage them. So worth considering before you use that tool what may or may not be under the floor. The other option would be to use something like this. Now this is a circular saw. It's quite a cheap, readily available saw, about £40, comes with a blade. So the disadvantage really of this is that the thickness of the blade is probably three times thicker than the blade that's on the multi-tool. So sometimes what can happen when you're cutting along this groove is that with the width of the blade you can end up actually trimming the board down, which means when you put the board back you're going to end up with a bit of a gap between it. So that's the disadvantage. However, it has one very good advantage, and that is you can set the depth of this blade to suit the board. So in this instance, if I rest that on the workbench, we can tighten that up. And I know that when I cut down this board, that will be exactly the depth of the board. However, we don't actually need to cut the whole depth. What we actually need is just to take the tongue off. So what I can actually do is release that blade and just lift it up ever so slightly, which guarantees that there's no way I'm going to then cut through anything under the floor. So if you're unsure what's under the floor, the circular saw may be the best tool for the job. So that's about the tools, and now I'm going to show you actually how to use them and lift the boards itself. Okay, so that's the cutting done. So what you're going to actually need to lift the boards. Now, I recommend a chisel, a claw hammer, and a thin crowbar. The reason a thin crowbar is so that you can actually get in between the boards without causing too much damage. So, first thing really is to start from one end. Now, this board has already got a natural join. So what we're going to try and do, you start to prise the board without the board splitting. So they're really tight. Actually take that nail out. So if you're struggling to get the nails out, your other option is actually to drive the nail through the board. So that could be an option. Now what we've got here is we've got a nail here that's proving quite difficult actually. So once you've got the board like this, the best thing you can do really is to lift it and then rest the board on something. Now what that does, that now allows you to either put something underneath and put more pressure on the board, or it allows you to then get something else in and start working your way down the board. So you can see how much pressure is here on these nails. You can see the board starting to bow. That really is not really what we want. So a bit of extra leverage, and now the nails are just starting to give. It's worth taking your time doing it, because what you don't want to do, you don't want to actually split the board. So if you were to split this board, the chance of you actually getting a new board from somewhere like B&Q the same thickness is pretty remote. If that property was newer, then you'd probably be able to get a board. Now, what you can see is this has been split where the nail's actually been put in originally. So what we don't want to do, we don't want to split that anymore, we want to keep the board as it is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get that underneath and prise the board there. And what you should be able to do is work the board out. Now this bit that's come off is actually the tongue. That's the tongue out of the board. Get that out. And that's how they fit together, and that's what we've got to take off, which allows us to lift the board. So before you do anything else, My advice would be get your floor hammer. Tap them nails so that they're flush, because otherwise if you stand on that, then what's going to happen is that's going to go straight into your foot. So what I'll do is where your joist is, especially this end, you can see the fixings are right on the end of the board. So that really is a chance for this board to split. You can see right there it's already started to split. So what I'd say is, if you line your ruler up and do a mark each end, when the board's back, we can carry that mark across and you know what room you've got to play with when you're refixing the board. So we can almost do the same thing at every joist. So next thing, put the board into place. Line it back up. So now we've got these marks, that will allow us to put lines across this board to show us where the actual joist is. Now we can go through the existing fixings, that is not a problem, and that's probably the preferred thing to do really. However, we've got a split in the board there, and the last thing we want to do is put a screw through that, because it will splay the board, which will split. And that edge of the board actually is on the tongue and groove side. So if we were to fix that, there's only a very little piece of timber there, so that will definitely split. So before we fix the board, these two fixings are fine. So what I've done, I've got the nails, compared the size of screw, got something very similar, just a slightly thicker gauge. The reason it's a thicker gauge is so that the screw will bite into the existing hole. So before we actually fix them, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pilot the board a little countersink. So what I've got here is a 3mm drill bit for timber, and what we're going to do is we're going to make a new fixing here. So I've got a roughly centre of the joist, come in a bit. Now what you can feel when that goes through the board and it goes into the joist. So what we actually want is a little pilot hole to go actually into the joist as well. Only slightly, just give the screw a start. So at this end of the board, if we continue this line across the board, now, what that means is we've got a little bit more room to manoeuvre. Now, if we, like I said, if we were to put a screw through this board will just split. You can already see there's a fine crack there and one there. So we're going to stay away from that area. So what we're going to do is just come in a bit. This is not a science. So by putting the fixings there, we're going to make sure we hit the joist below, but we're also going to give the timber a chance so that it doesn't split. So what we're going to do with this end, this is a little bit different. We'll put the 3mm bit through, a slight angle towards the joist below. And then I'm going to actually change that drill bit for a slightly bigger bit, because what I don't want to do, I don't want to put any pressure on this actual floorboard. So what I've got now is a 4mm drill bit. And we're just going to go only through the board itself. And then if we countersink these bits, that'll ensure there's no pressure on that actual joint. So again, we'll get our screws. Now the trick with these really is not to over tighten them, especially at this end. And that's them into the board without it splitting. It's just the other one at the other end to finish off. So as you can see, using the existing nail holes, what you normally find is actually the nails are on an angle. They're not normally straight, they're normally on the angle. Now, that's fine, but it does put extra pressure on the actual floorboard itself. So you can use the existing fixings, but if they're really on an angle, be aware that as you tighten that up, there's every chance that the board will split. And that is the board finished. The only other thing you should probably do, walk on it, check that it doesn't squeak. And if you're happy with it, job done. Okay, so that's the end of the project. Quite straightforward really. As with any of these projects, if you just stop, take your time, try and plan what you're going to do before you start. Make sure you've got the right tools, the right materials before you start the job. Makes life a lot easier. So a few tips really for lifting these boards. The first thing I would say is the cutting. It really is worth investing in something like this. This is a multi-tool, so this particular one is Bosch. However, you can get all sorts of makes. Relatively cheap really. This particular Bosch model came with a couple of attachments, a sanding pad that goes on the end, this particular cutter and the semi-circular cutter. Like I said before, it's a thin gauge which allows you to get into tight space where a normal saw would struggle. So that is really worth investing in. The other thing is this. All it is a thin crowbar. So what do I mean by that? Obviously, the way it tapers down to a thin piece of metal, a normal crowbar is quite substantial, and it wouldn't allow you to get into these gaps to lift the boards. Now, I use this for all sorts. You can use it for prizing off skirting board, for lifting doors, when you're working out hinges, obviously for lifting floorboards. Really worth investing and relatively cheap. So I'll leave a link below for one of these crowbars and one of these multi-tools. So any questions or comments, please leave them on the video and I'll get back to you accordingly. Hope you like what you've seen. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. See you soon.